She built a hidden shed under her cabin. Then it saved her during a snowstorm. The first thing Elinor Marsh did when she bought the land was walk every inch of it alone. Not with the realtor, not with her sister who had driven 3 hours to give her unsolicited opinions, not with the property inspector whose clipboard and rubber-soled shoes squeaked against the pine floors, alone, the way she preferred most things. The property was 11 acres in the northern Montana highlands, a patch of wilderness so remote that the nearest town, a place called Dunmore with a population of 340 and a post office that closed at noon on Fridays, was 2 miles down a gravel road that turned to mud in spring and became a sheet of polished ice by November. There was a cabin already on it, a one-room structure built sometime in the 1940s by a trapper whose name nobody remembered, with walls of notched spruce logs and a roof that had been patched and re-patched so many times it looked like a quilt. Elinor stood in the middle of that single room and turned in a slow circle, breathing in the smell of old pine and cold stone and something else beneath it, something mineral and clean that she couldn't name but recognized as exactly what she had been looking for. She was 43 years old. She had spent 20 years as a structural engineer for a firm in Minneapolis, designing bridges and overpasses and the kinds of unglamorous but necessary infrastructures that held cities together. Without anyone noticing, she was good at her work. She was also, quietly and thoroughly, exhausted by it, by the meetings and the liability reviews and the particular way her male colleagues would repeat her suggestions back to the room a few minutes later as though the idea had originated with them. She was not running away from her life so much as walking towards something she couldn't yet see but could feel the pull of, the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. She bought the property in September, closed in 3 weeks, and moved in before the first hard frost. Her neighbors, such as they were, thought she was either brave or foolish, and a few thought both. A woman named Greta Sorensen, who lived 6 miles east with her husband and ran beef cattle on a spread that had been in her family for 4 generations, came by the second week with a jar of canned tomatoes and the frank assessment that Elinor probably didn't know what she was getting into. Elinor thanked her for the tomatoes and didn't argue. Greta left with the look of a woman reserving judgment. What Elinor did know that her neighbors didn't was structures. She knew how weight moved through wood and stone. She knew what frost did to foundations and what poor drainage did to footings. And within her first 2 weeks on the property, walking every morning before the light had fully committed to the day, she discovered something that rearranged her plans entirely. The cabin sat on a slight rise, and beneath its eastern corner, where the foundation logs rested against a natural shelf of limestone, the ground was hollow. She found it by accident the way most good things are found. She stepped wrong near the corner of the cabin, and her foot went through a thin crust of frozen soil into empty air beneath. She caught herself on the cabin wall and knelt down in the frost-stiff grass, pulling back the matted weeds, and found a depression roughly 6 feet across and covered by a lattice of old boards so rotten they had begun to look like soil themselves. She pried one up with a stick and shone a flashlight into the space below. It was a root cellar, old, predating the cabin likely, perhaps dug by whoever had first tried to homestead the land before the trapper, before anyone living could remember. The walls were dry, stacked stone, and the floor was packed earth. The ceiling, the underside of the cabin's foundation, was low, maybe 5 feet at the highest point, but the space extended back farther than her flashlight could easily reach. It was cold and dark and smelled of old earth, and faintly of something woody, like the ghost of root vegetables stored long ago. Elinor sat back in the grass and looked at it for a long time. She told no one. This was not deception exactly. It was more the instinct of a person who has spent years watching good ideas disappear in committees, who has learned that silence is the first protection of anything worth building. She began quietly, on evenings and weekend days, when the light lasted long enough and the ground was still soft enough to work. She spent 3 months on it. She reinforced the existing stone walls with mortar, mixing small batches by hand so she didn't have to rent equipment that would attract attention. She poured a thin concrete floor in sections, letting each section cure before moving to the next. She extended the space in one direction, following the natural limestone shelf, digging by hand with a mattock and a short-handled spade, filling buckets of earth and carrying them out to the tree line where she spread them in thin layers that the rain and frost would work back into the ground. She installed a low door of heavy timber, set it into a frame she built herself, and hinged it with commercial hinges she painted flat black so they wouldn't catch the light. From above, with the original depression refilled and returfed, and a stack of firewood placed over the most obvious seam, there was nothing to see. She ran a power line from the cabin's electrical panel, just a single 50-amp circuit, enough for light and a small outlet. She installed a wood burning stove the size of a barrel, vented through a pipe that emerged between 2 rocks at the base of the limestone shelf where it looked, to any passing eye, like a natural seam in the stone. She built shelves along 3 walls. She put in a plank cot with a foam pad, 2 wool blankets sealed in compression bags, a first aid kit, and a 5-gallon water jug. She stocked the shelves the way she stocked all her projects, methodically, thinking through scenarios. Canned goods, dried beans and rice in sealed buckets, a hand, crank radio, candles, a fire striker, a headlamp with 2 sets of spare batteries, a small library of reference books she thought she might actually use, a first aid manual, a foraging guide for the Northern Rockies, a field guide to edible plants, a thick paperback novel she'd been meaning to read for years. When it was finished, she stood in it with a single bare bulb burning and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, which was complete satisfaction. Not the relief of finishing a project at work, which always came tangled with the anxiety of the next project. This was cleaner than that. This was the feeling of having built something that was entirely her own, for reasons that were entirely her own, answerable to no one. She called it, in her own mind, the underroom. She never called it a bunker because bunkers were built out of fear, and she hadn't built this out of fear. She'd built it out of the same instinct that had made her a good engineer, the instinct to understand what could go wrong and to make provision for it before it went wrong. The underroom wasn't a reaction, it was a readiness. The winter came in October and came hard. By November, the gravel road to Dunmore had iced over twice and been sanded twice by the county truck, and Elinor had learned that the county truck was not reliable about timing. She had stocked her cabin well, a chest freezer in the corner filled with venison she'd bought from Greta's husband, shelves of preserves, 100-gallon propane tank for the range, and a cord and a half of split wood stacked under the cabin's lean-to overhang. The cabin's wood stove was adequate if she kept it fed. She thought she was ready for winter. She was not, as it turned out, ready for this winter. The storm that arrived in the 3rd week of January was not on any forecast she'd seen when she'd last driven to Dunmore and used the library's Wi-Fi on a Thursday. The forecasts had shown a system moving through, some snow, cold temperatures, the usual. What actually arrived was something different, a combination of a deep Alberta clipper dropping down from Canada and a moisture-heavy system pushing up from the southwest, the 2 of them colliding over the Montana highlands and generating the kind of event that meteorologists describe with unusual adjectives. It began as snow on a Tuesday evening, soft and steady, the kind Elinor had come to enjoy, the kind that made the world outside the window look like a thing held still. She went to bed with the stove loaded and the temperature in the cabin a comfortable 62 degrees. She woke at 3 in the morning to a sound she didn't immediately recognize, a low, sustained roaring that she lay in the dark trying to place for a full 30 seconds before she understood it was wind. She got up and went to the window and could see nothing. Not the tree line 20 feet away, not the woodpile 6 feet from the door. Nothing but white, moving so fast it looked like static on an old television. She dressed quickly and added wood to the stove and stood in the cabin's warmth, listening to the building flex and breathe around her. The logs groaned in a way she hadn't heard them groan before. The windows were pane glass she'd replaced in October, and she watched them bow slightly inward under pressure and spring back, bow and spring, like something breathing. Outside, the wind was beyond anything she had a useful number for. She tried the radio and got static. She tried her phone and had no signal. She almost never had a signal at the cabin, which was something she'd made her peace with, but she would have liked a signal now. By Wednesday morning, the snow was 4 feet deep and still falling, and the wind had not stopped. She opened the cabin door a crack and was hit immediately with a wall of cold so intense it felt like a physical blow. The air so full of ice crystals that breathing it without covering her face was impossible. She shut the door. The thermometer on the outside of the wall read 14 below 0 Fahrenheit, and that was without accounting for the wind. She was not panicking. She had her wood and her food and her stove, and she had built a sturdy enough life in this cabin that a bad storm was not, in itself, a crisis. But on Wednesday afternoon, as she was feeding the stove its third loading of the day, she heard something that rearranged her assessment of the situation. She heard a creak from above, not the ordinary creak of thermal expansion, not the groaning of logs she'd grown accustomed to, but something lower, something that traveled through the structure itself and made the floor vibrate under her feet. She looked up at the ceiling, the snow load. She should have thought of it sooner. She was an engineer, and she had thought about the roof in October, had noted that it was patched and re-patched, and had calculated, roughly, that it could handle a reasonable load. What was on it now was not a reasonable load. 4 feet of snow was approximately 20 pounds per square foot if it was light powder. If the wind had consolidated and crusted it, which whined at these speeds certainly had, it could be 40 pounds per square foot or more. She walked to the center of the cabin and looked up at the ceiling beams and saw what she had been afraid to see. A slight, unmistakable bow in the central rafter. She put on every layer she owned 3 thermal shirts, a wool sweater, her insulated work pants over thermal leggings, 2 pairs of wool socks, her heaviest boots, her down parka, her balaclava, her hat, her mittens over her liner gloves, and she opened the cabin door into the storm and fought her way to the woodpile under the lean-to overhang. The lean-to was still standing, sheltered somewhat by the cabin's leeward side. She loaded her arms with wood and came back inside. She did this 4 more times, stacking wood inside the cabin until she had what she estimated was enough for 3 days. If the roof held, if it didn't hold, she needed to not be trying to make wood runs. She ate dinner, reheated soup, crackers, dried apricots, and sat with her mug of tea and thought carefully and honestly about what she was facing. The roof was under extraordinary stress. The temperature outside was, if anything, dropping further. The storm showed no signs of abating. If the roof failed, the cabin would go from shelter to death trap in a matter of minutes. She was 22 miles from the nearest town on a road that was certainly impassable and probably invisible. No one was coming for her. No one knew she needed anyone to come. She looked at the floor. She looked at the corner of the cabin where, beneath a braided rug she'd bought at a Dunmore garage sale, there was a